All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to week 11, which I think is technically week 12. I don't know what week it is, but welcome to the next unit of curriculum for this class, next topic for this class. We only have this week on SLA, on the SLA component um, and the like personality assessments. We've been looking at like the Big Five and Myers-Briggs. And then next week we have one more week on that where we're going to look at, I think, a linguistic aptitude. But then after that, we get a switch to Clifton Strengths and more pointedly positive psychology, but we'll still reference the Big Five and those things and SLA during that time together. But I mentioned that because basically you'll want to return to the syllabus, and I have a note in there about purchasing the Clifton Strengths Assessment. So if you want to buy that from me, you can start coordinating that in advance with me, or you can purchase it online separately. It just costs more. Again, I'm not making money off of you. I'm selling it to you at the cost it costs me to buy it. So we don't need that for like until a little less than 2 weeks. So you'll want to go ahead and get on top of that. But today we're going to talk about a major framework, a major theory and framework in SLA, which is this notion of willingness to communicate. So the willingness to communicate, again, it's a theory and framework. This is the theory. We'll look at the framework in a second. It basically seeks to explain why some individuals are more inclined to engage in communication, particularly in second and or like foreign language. So it was initially actually developed in the context of first language, so L1 communication, back in 1985. And so or 1976 even, it goes back even further. So in 1976, Burgon, I don't know how to say his name, he developed this theory basically under just general communication theories, right? He's just looking at first language. He's not even thinking second language, but just trying to describe the different communication preferences of people. And so he coined the notion of unwillingness to communicate. And then later in 85, that was still in first language use, conceptualized as a willingness to communicate. And later in like 1998, McIntyre et al., like names you're going to see on repeat in this, expanded the theory to basically to expand it to second language acquisition. So we're focusing at its birth is out of first language use, but we're focusing on it from the SLA context. So in like the L2 context, it represents the probability that a learner will initiate communication using the target language in a given situation. So the concept is crucial in SLA or in second language learning because it highlights the importance of both language ability and communication motivation. So even if a learner has a high proficiency, right, they're very proficient in the language, they may not communicate if they lack the willingness to do so. So basically, the theory represents the probability that a learner will choose to speak in a given situation, and it considers psychological and sociological and situational factors, which we'll look at it in a second when we get to the framework component. But there's different definitions to what willingness to communicate means, but they're all relatively the same. So the probability of engaging in communication when free to do so, a readiness to enter into discourse with a specific person in a specific time using the second language, the dynamic nature of a learner's desire to initiate communication. So basically, it defines itself in its name. Does the learner have a willingness to communicate in the target language? So this theory of willingness to communicate comes from other theoretical backgrounds. And so just to name a few of those, there's this idea of communication apprehension, which is like a fear or anxiety associated with communicating in the target language. And obviously this influences willingness to communicate. Social cognitive theory, you recognize that from our first or second week in class together. So confidence or self-efficacy and past experiences and how those affect one's readiness to communicate. Intergroup communication styles, so a speaker's perception of their social identity, and their group membership and how that influences their communication tendencies, and also personality theory, personality traits. So that's actually accounted for in this model, which is why it's pertinent to what we're looking at. The concept of willingness to communicate is crucial because in SLA, especially because it highlights that beyond linguistic competence, language competence, linguistic competence, which is like the language learner's knowledge of the language down to, how having phonological competence, grammatical, syntactical competence, right? So knowing how the language works. So it goes beyond that and asserts that learners need to be motivated and confident enough to engage in communication. So it's kind of more on the performance side rather than the competence side. So at one time, it was considered like the single most important variable. This idea of willingness to communicate was considered the most important variable. And so we get this idea that the ultimate goal of language learning is to develop a willingness to communicate in the target language. And that's from, the late 90s. But even prior to that, Widdowson, and this is before the theory was in SLA, but the goal, he said the goal of language learning is to engender in the speaker a willingness to communicate, right? So these are very strong statements. These both assert that there is one goal, and that is to make you willing to communicate in the language you're learning. So at one point, this was the most important variable, but now, it's now just considered one of many factors, a part of SLA, as part of the goals of second language learning. So many researchers still uphold that willingness to communicate is a strong predictor, though, of actual language use. And we'll look at how that's predicted because there's actually an assessment we'll look at the end. But again, it's just one of many factors, such as another factor would be linguistic competence, which we just mentioned earlier, right? So it's not just about being willing to communicate, but you also still need to have linguistic competence. So like a learner with a high willingness to communicate, but a low linguistic competence is going to struggle in communication. However, a learner that's highly proficient, so like a high linguistic competence, but a low willingness to communicate, so an unwillingness to communicate, they're going to succeed in like structured contexts, like academic writing, right? But in general, they're not going to open doors to practice, right, in verbal settings. Other factors that scholars argue are like just as important as being willing to communicate are like motivation and identity, right? So Dornier argues that motivation is a huge component, but you're going to see that's actually built into the scale. So into this framework, identity, a lot of scholars, this is early 2000s, I think it's still a big thing, but your L2 identity plays a big role in your language acquisition process. Social and cultural context. So some cultures may discourage you from speaking openly due to like their collectivist values. And we talked, actually, this is again, not connected to personality directly yet, but you're recognizing that type of comment because we covered it earlier on in the semester where we talked about like Western ideas of personality versus more, we use the example of like, I think Japan at the time, but those collectivist values, like speaking openly isn't valued, right? But this person still may have a high willingness to communicate. But what I'm saying is that willingness to communicate is a goal, but so are, and it is an important aspect predicting success in a language, but so is the cultural background. So is the student's identity and motivation. So really you have to take an integral approach, but willingness to communicate is still very popular years later. So it's not out. It's just that it needs to be integrated with other features. So that's the theory. That's the theory behind the willingness to communicate. Let's talk about the frame. Oh, I guess one comment I want to make before I change slides. If you're not familiar with the distinction between framework theory, and then there's models and constructs, last year, Dr. Tardo gave a lab that was really interesting, one of our weekly lab meetings on that very topic. So I've linked it in the PowerPoint. And when this is made available to you in the course shell. It's like probably 50 minutes long, but if you're interested in the distinction between those terms, it's a great presentation. So let's talk about the framework though, for this theory. How can we conceptualize it a little bit? So it's a multi-layered pyramid that illustrates the different factors that affect a willingness to communicate. And it's structured in a very particular way. So from long-term influences at the bottom to situation-based factors at the top. So I'm going to go through each of these kind of in a top-down approach, because as you noticed probably at the bottom, I've circled a very important cornerstone of this model, which is personality. So we're going to build our way down the pyramid up to personality. So layer one, this is like the ultimate goal, right? This is the actual use of the L2 to communicate. These are the observable outcomes of all preceding influences. So all the stuff below in the pyramid, if it's working well, then you get to layer one, which means you're using the language. Layer two, this is the immediate willingness to communicate in a given situation. So it's directly influenced by motivation and situational factors, which you find in a couple layers below. Layer three, situated antecedents. As I said that word out loud, I'm not sure I pronounced it correctly, but you can read. So there's your word for you. There's two key influences that impact the immediate willingness to communicate, and that's the desire to communicate with a specific person. So familiarity, group affiliation, and then there's state communicative self-confidence, which is like your self-perceived confidence and anxiety levels, right? So as you can see, this layer is very situational, but it definitely is a barrier to cross to get into willingness to communicate. You're going to start hearing some words like anxiety and confidence and things you're going to hear later, even though we're going to work further down the pyramid, because a lot of these terms we've used earlier in the semester. Layer four, motivational propensities. So we've got three factors here. We've got interpersonal motivation, so the desire to form relationships, intergroup attitudes, your perception of L2 speakers, and then L2 self-confidence. So your own belief in your ability to use the language. Layer five, I think we're at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes. Intergroup attitude. There's three again. There's intergroup attitudes, social situation, and communicative competence. So intergroup attitudes show the learner's attitude of cooperation with the group and feeling contentment while acquiring a language. The social situation variable deals with social factors in a specific context of communication happening in a community. And then communicative competence, we've used this term, refers to the person's L2 proficiency, which can obviously, all of these can impact one's degree of being willing to communicate. I'm not an expert on this model. That I've explained the top 5 layers to the degree that I need to know them, and that, you don't even need to know the degree to which I just described those. But as the basic knowledge of each of the layers is useful as we move down into layer 6. And this last layer is called, these are called your enduring influences. This is the societal and individual context layer. So real quick, just to get these out of the way, we got intergroup climate and then personality, but also in this layer, kind of encompassed in personality, are the individualistic variables like the learner's age, the learner's gender, just other things of identity. So those are enduring influences. Your age will always impact you. Your gender will always impact you. Your personality will always impact you. So there's 2 categories here, though, that I'll just lightly define, but just know gender and age and those other individualistic variables are included in there. The intergroup climate and personality. So I guess the intergroup climate, it's the learner's views towards the L group, the value they ascribe to it. There tendency to increase closeness between the L1 and L2 groups. So that idea of membership again, we're really concerned with, which is what I'm trying to build down to, was the cornerstone of personality. And this, again, these are called enduring influences. And that term might sound a little familiar, because if you think back to how we defined personality earlier on this semester, these were considered personality traits are considered like enduring, long-term traits that continue with you across time, right? So built in this model is also the idea that personality traits are not situational. They don't flux. You're not going to change much. They're constant in you. So it's placed at the bottom of the model framework, not a model. It's a framework. It's a pyramid model, but it's a framework. Again, watch Tardo's lecture, because it's a long-term stable factor influencing communication. And so what you're going to find is a lot of studies that actually correlate the big 5 traits, and we'll talk about that briefly ahead, to willingness to communicate. Personality, so like the modern take on this right now is personality does not directly determine willingness to communicate. Like that's how we need to conceptualize it, but you'll see some of the scholarship seems to assert that it's very influential. But the idea is that your personality is interacting with like the interpersonal intergroup factors that build upon, like it's the foundation, right? But it's interacting with layers 1 through 5 at the same time. So it's constantly there. It's influential, right? It's enduring. They're considered, I'm trying to figure out, if there's anything I didn't say about this. They definitely influence how individuals respond to, I think there's some scholarship to layers 2 and 3. And you can see that immediate correlation, because layer 3, we've got, again, the situational things of desire to communicate with a specific person. We see that already sounds like a question on an introversion extroversion scale, right? So they again consider all these layers as interrelated, but this bottom layer is considered your foundational self. Trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to say. Take a look at my notes real quick. Oh, I guess one thing about the model, and we'll talk about this on the critique slide on the next slide as well. It's not someone's willingness to communicate is not a fixed thing, right? You're not always willing to communicate. You're not always unwilling to communicate. We have to view this framework and theory as kind of something that's constantly in flux. So that's important too for recognizing this. But we'll want to talk about a couple of the critiques with the model, and then I have my own critique, which is where we'll kind of spend the rest of class. It's still highly influential. So the critiques don't basically, they don't do away with the theory and they don't do away with the framework, but it's definitely been expanded upon and discussed in different ways in more recent scholarship. And one of the main critiques is that it's too linear and it's too static. So the pyramid kind of represents a hierarchical top-down model, assuming that the lower layers predict higher layers in a fixed, stable way. And that's kind of how it's presented. I don't know that I agree with that. I think, I think we can agree that it's very interrelated, right? The different layers talk to each other. But knowing what we know about personality theory, as we've studied in this class, like we do, I hope you're seeing it is kind of a cornerstone. It is something that influences maybe how some of those other layers work. But notably things like anxiety were very high on the scale, right? Recall how, let me go back real quick. Anxiety, what you're going to find is that that's usually addressed up here in layer 3. and layer 4 was self-confidence. But we know from our work in personality theory that anxiety can also be regarded as a personality trait, right? So what you're going to see come ahead is that anxiety is treated as a separate issue, as a byproduct of layer 6. So layer 6, for example, or spoiler alert, you have introversion. And then therefore it's predicted that in layer 4 and 3, you're going to have anxiety or like lower self-esteem, right? So, so looking at it as a static one directional model doesn't help with that. Basically, it's also discounts that things happen in real time. There's immediate emotions, there's immediate context and interactions rather than like a predetermined sequence of things, right? So we have to look at it more maybe in a circular sense. Let's see here. The lack of sociocultural and identity considerations, not identify. So this is going to sound familiar, but this model was originally developed in Western contexts, I think specifically in Canada, which is an individualistic culture. So it doesn't account for collectivist cultures where group harmony, saving face, and social hierarchies definitely influence willingness to communicate. So now we also see that similar notion. We kind of discussed a similar issue earlier in the semester when we talked about even the ideas of personality and extroversion are very Western influenced, right? So so it's that issue doesn't fall, that the issue of Western societies kind of leading the wave on some of these models and theories, it's still very underpinned by the fact we have a cultural preference for what is the best outcome of something. So we have a cultural preference for extroversion typically in Western societies. We have a cultural preference for excessive talking in Western society. So that's reflected in personality theory, but it's also reflected in this framework. Let's see here. The idea of identity, learners' investment in their L2, the power dynamics, the social positioning also impact willingness to communicate. And even more so than just maybe sometimes even more so than personality or motivation. So when we discuss personality in this class, we also talked about how cultural and social norms can take precedent over how our personality manifests. So I am an extrovert, right? But based on the context, the social norms, my social positioning, I know when to shut that off, not because I'm not still wanting to extrovert, but I know that my role and my identity in society might need to change in a situation. So yeah, social power, identity, motivation, all these things, long-term interest in global interactions, all of those influence willingness to communicate, but they're not necessarily that accounted for in the model. Another thing is that the digital, because the framework is so old, it obviously predates a lot of where we're at with everything, every place we're at with technology at this point. So it doesn't really account for or address online communication, which has become a major part of language learning, right? And language use. So in digital spaces, social media, texting, willingness to communicate, changes depend a lot on response time and communication format and anonymity. I don't know if I'm saying that word right. So the model of willingness to communicate is tied to like a single L2, but modern, the other issue of it is that with the multilingual communication is that the model is basically tied to L2, but there's many learners, especially nowadays, who switch between multiple languages. And so there might be an effect on their willingness to communicate because of the different contexts in which they're doing that in. The pyramid, see, I would argue that another issue, so issue 4, it doesn't fully address emotional and psychological features. I'm just synthesizing, by the way, critiques that I was reading on the model. it doesn't necessarily explore like deep levels of emotions. Again, like you saw anxiety, some of these really deep level emotions, so deep that to me, because we know in what we know in personality theory, they're trait level, they're enduring characteristics. But it moves it up as if it's situational, right? Context dependent. So it doesn't really explore emotions as a as a at a deep state. Personality shifts, psychological states that some do fluctuate moment to moment, but some are enduring characteristics, and it treats them as if they are moment to moment. So that would be another critique. I know that one scholar was talking about, he proposed that willingness to communicate is like a constantly changing emotion-based process, so that there should be more emotion-based in the base layer of that pyramid structure. So what we do know is that this theory, though, and this framework provides a strong foundation for understanding a willingness to communicate. Like there is something to this, right? We're not going to disregard it. And it does highlight psychological and contextual influences on communication. And it's very useful for designing language learning environments that promote willingness to communicate. So this is extremely applicable to the classroom. The main critiques are that it's not dynamic enough, that it doesn't deal with enough with sociocultural and identity related aspects, and that it's also maybe a little outdated because it doesn't necessarily take into account the age of digital communication, right? Where communicating could look much different. So just rehashing some of the factors affecting willingness to communicate, and a lot of these are built into the model, are most obvious for us personality traits. So we've got these internal psychological and personal factors such as personality traits, motivation, self-perceived confidence, anxiety, L2 identity. And then we've got external factors, social and environmental, which would be like classroom environment, interlocutors. By the way, how do you guys say that word? Interlocutors or interlocutors? Because I hear it two different ways. But interlocutors, I think is how I normally say it. Topics of discussion and cultural norms. And it's really interesting if you look at these topics because we've addressed many of them in this class. And the intention of addressing motivation, self-perceived confidence, anxiety, classroom environments, topics of discussion, the reason we were addressing those had nothing to do with building up to willingness to communicate, but we were recognizing those already early on in this class as very important facets to distinguish from personality traits, but also important facets in language learning or in language use. So it's kind of interesting that the scale, to a large degree, the framework does largely accommodate some of those hot topic issues that we've also addressed in the class. One of the cool things about this framework, though, is that you definitely, it's different from a model, because a model, once you watch the lecture from Attardo, if you want to, it's optional. A model is a lot more, it is easy to implement, but also has assessment points, right? And this framework doesn't have ways, you're not brought with ways necessarily to assess each of those layers, right? It's just an idea, it's a conceptual thing. But there are a lot of, it's extremely useful from a pedagogical sense. And there's direct interventions you can bring into the classroom to influence a student's willingness to communicate. So what they're finding, again, as I said earlier, your willingness to communicate is not static. You're not always willing or always unwilling. It fluctuates because it's not a static characteristic of you. It's extremely modifiable, right? So educators can take steps to actually improve your willingness to communicate. And what the scholarship usually suggesting is, oh, you can encourage a positive classroom environment, which I would think would be pretty obvious. But by doing so, you reduce fear of mistakes and promoting a supportive environment. Some scholars suggest using group activities, but as you recall from our work or our reading or whatever we did that week on classroom instruction, group activities ain't for everyone. You can take proactive steps to enhance self-perceived competence. So provide opportunities for meaningful communication, give positive reinforcement and constructive feedback. You can aim to reduce anxiety. So incorporate low stakes speaking tasks would be an example. Avoid excessive correction in the initial stages of like conversation practice. Work to increase motivation. So connect L2 learners with connect L2 learning with a student's personal goals. Use engaging real world communication tasks. The other aspect of this was you could promote intercultural understanding, so encourage exposure to L2 communities, foster a growth mindset regarding language learning. So this is kind of overall the scholarship's painting on ways that you can actually take approaches in the classroom to increase a student's willingness to communicate. A lot of these, again, it's really interesting because if you take into consideration what we just discovered about language learning strategies and parallel that in with these suggestions, it's the idea of reducing anxiety for an extrovert and introvert might not be the same approach, right? So, for example, one of the scholarship pieces I had mentioned during I think it was, I don't know if it was during classroom instruction or during the language learning strategies chapter, was this idea that extroverts tend to prefer conversational partners with their peers, whereas an introvert prefers it usually with the teacher or someone kind of more someone that they perceive as more competent with the language, right? So basically, I need a conversational partner that I know is going to be a good conversational partner. So reducing anxiety for an extrovert would mean putting them with a peer, where reducing anxiety with an introvert would mean pairing them with a teacher. So there's still, we can't take all these approaches and just apply a blanket approach of, okay, now you're going to talk with your peers, because we already know for the introvert that might not be the best way to reduce anxiety. And that's all assuming that the introvert has anxiety, right? We can't be presumptive on that. We do know, though, from the research, though, that there are that you as an educator have influence on the students' willingness to communicate. And a lot of what you do with your classroom organization and your instructional strategies will impact that, right? So we want to be mindful as teachers. But I do think it's interesting how if we're mindfully bringing in personality traits, the way to encourage a willingness to communicate is going to look very different. I think what we're finding, and especially with last week's curriculum on linguistic, like the 4 language learning skills and linguistic domains, is that everything is kind of pointing back to classroom instruction and language learning strategies. And so we're finding that with willingness to communicate as well, right? It all goes back to language learning strategies and the teacher's work in classroom instruction. So I mentioned the digital and online learning context kind of earlier and how it's kind of not, doesn't account for that. But with the rise of online education, they're now starting to study WTC, willingness to communicate in virtual environments. Some of the stuff they found is that like a social presence and online discussion enhances a willingness to communicate. Anonymity can sometimes reduce anxiety and increase participation. So anonymous discussion boards. Gamification boosts motivation. Video-based interactions can mimic real life conversations and encourage speaking. So digital tools can help shy learners develop a willingness to communicate. So everything's pointing to, and as we saw earlier in our semester coursework, that the online learning environment has an influence and a positive influence on engendering a willingness to communicate. Which is great, because we know that with some personality traits like introversion, the online learning context is super valuable to them. So if we're seeing that method encourages a willingness to communicate, then we should feel comfortable to give them those opportunities to learn language that way. But I want to talk about personality traits, right? That's kind of where this was all pointing. So you have a good idea now of how the willingness to communicate model works, the theory works, how the framework works. There's a lot of components to it. It's not all about personality, but personality is highly regarded as a major facet of it. And I guess I want to share that I found that very interesting when I first came across the framework because it is highly used. It is highly regarded. I'm thinking a couple of you have at least heard of it before. And how personality was such a blatant cornerstone of engendering in people the motivation to communicate in the target language. But what's fascinating about that to me is that when you look at, and let me go back actually real quick. I am not an SLA expert. I know enough to do what I need to do, but I have not spent my career in this like maybe some of my colleagues, right? Like my career obviously is spent in other disciplines. But what's really interesting is you don't have to be a second language acquisition expert to see that when you look at this pyramid, that there are a lot of studies out there on attitudes and motivation and self-confidence, willingness to communicate, communicative competence, and the influence of culture. A lot of these layers are thoroughly studied in SLA literature, right? And they should be, because we can see in this framework, they're very important for language learning and that process and understanding the language learner. What was interesting to me, though, wasn't that those were studied so much. It's what was interesting to me is why personality, which is clearly very prominent, it's the foundation of the pyramid, right, was studied so little. I mean, here we recognize its importance, but the amount of literature dedicated to that section of this, to that layer in general, but specifically quadrant 12, I think is what it is. It's the theory argues that it's vital, yet the amount of research dedicated to it is very small. So I always found that very interesting, which is why this is warranting its own discussion to me, because it's one of an area of SLA that really promotes what I've been promoting in this class is just the vital role of personality. So what you're going to find in as part of the discussion board this week, which is what we've done in the previous weeks, is I'm obviously going to focus, turn the attention to, if you have any guesses, I'm going to turn the attention to introversion here in a minute, because the extroversion and introversion, when you hear the phrase willingness to communicate, you don't even have to answer because you're going to do it in your head. But who do you think is more willing to communicate, extroverts or introverts? We're going to look at those studies in a minute. So what you'll do with the discussion board is I want you to explore a different personality trait. And what you're namely going to find is work with the big five. There's ample amount of studies on the big five and the willingness to communicate theory and framework. So you're going to find one and synthesize that for the class as we've done in prior weeks. But I just wanted to talk about this a little bit. And I didn't put scholarship on here for a reason so that you can go find an article and it might say the same thing. But these 5 traits have been studied numerous times in terms of their connections to willingness to communicate. And obviously starting with extroversion, you know, extroverts, as we know, are characterized by their sociability and their assertiveness. Those are some of the manifestations, right? There has been quite a bit of work finding a strong correlation between being an extrovert and having a higher propensity to communicate, right? A higher willingness to communicate. You know, the extroverted individuals are more inclined to engage in communication because they're just sociable by nature, right? And several studies have shown that high levels of extroversion predict in advance a higher level of willingness to communicate. Extroverts have lower communication apprehension and higher perceived communication competence, right? So remember, again, in that pyramid, we've got personality at the bottom and self-esteem, communication competence, all those individual sub-factors working up the pyramid. Extroverts are likened to being more successful, or I'm sorry, rating themselves and evaluating themselves higher, right? So there's lots of scholarship arguing that. I'm going to present a flip side of that in a minute with introversion, but by and large, it makes sense to me. it makes sense to me based on what willingness to communicate is, as it presently is taught to us, the extroversion would obviously scale higher than introversion in this model. Agreeableness, this there's high agreeableness and low agreeableness. So those high in agreeableness are relatively cooperative and compassionate. And what that trait has done is shown a moderate correlation with willingness to communicate. So individuals high in agreeableness, they're more willing to communicate for the sense of maintaining social harmony. And so you're going to find a couple studies, some as recent as 2019, showing the correlation between agreeableness and a willingness to communicate. Conscientiousness, so there's high conscientiousness, right, and low conscientiousness. High conscientiousness, again, in the Myers-Briggs is like that judging category. These are organized, diligent people. The relationship between that low conscientiousness and high conscientiousness is like kind of nuanced, right? So it's generally high conscientiousness specifically, right? And let me clarify, one of the critiques I have about the Big Five scale is that I feel like it's typically like we have extroversion, right? But then we have introversion, which doesn't get named. We have conscientiousness, right? But we don't have low conscientiousness, which doesn't get named. So a lot of studies, I feel like, just focus on the named trait rather than the binary, right? The opposite. So in general, with conscientiousness, we don't have a study necessarily showing the high conscientiousness relationship to willingness to communicate or the low conscientiousness willingness relationship to communicate. But basically either end of the scale, its relationship to WTC is just like less pronounced. Some studies suggest that high conscientiousness individuals may engage in communication when they have a higher willingness to communicate when it's a structured and goal-oriented activity, right? Which makes sense with the literature we've looked at. And it also makes sense a little bit with some of my own L1 research in terms of the judging personality trait and speech as well. But there's not a lot there. So I'd be curious what article you find, if you want to find one there, what it ultimately proposes. Then we've got emotional stability, which is the opposite of neuroticism. So people with high emotional stability, again, remain calm, they're balanced. And those with high emotional stability are found to be less prone to anxiety, which therefore is argued it positively influences a willingness to communicate. Whereas those with high neuroticism experience more communication apprehension, and so it reduces their willingness to communicate in conversation, willingness to engage in conversation. Openness to experience, by and large, this has varying correlations to willingness to communicate. But one thing I want to, let me make this comment first. Some studies find a positive relationship between being open to experience and a willingness to communicate. So remember, those who are open to experience, have that openness to experience, are very imaginative, they're very curious, they're usually very open-minded about ideas. And so what one study suggested was that when the conversation is on a really diverse, interesting, like theoretical or deep topic, that they have those high in openness to experience have a higher willingness to communicate because of the topic type, right? Which makes sense if you go back here and we talk about the pedagogical implications. That fifth item there was to promote intercultural understanding. If you recall back to when we discussed the openness to experience versus close to experience category, those who were high in openness to experience were usually more open to cultural differences and going against cultural norms, and whereas those who were close to experience were more traditional, more committed to cultural norms, right? So it makes sense how you can promote a willingness to communicate with those openness to experience individuals by focusing more on the intercultural understanding. So just bringing it all full circle. But some of these findings, by the way, with openness to experience are inconsistent, and there definitely needs to be more research on that particular trait. Another thing that's not on here, but we can regard it as a trait because it is in Clifton Strengths is this idea of empathy, right? It is a personality trait. Now, in the big five, it's accounted for under agreeableness. In the Myers-Briggs, it's accounted for under feeling. But it in itself is its own construct, right? Empathy is. So when we take Clifton Strengths, you'll see it's one of the 34 talents, and it's one that I have, right? I say that like, I have that. I have empathy in my top 5. So this is the ability to understand and share in others' feelings. And a study, it was just 2 years ago. I think it was, it's like Zohorian, I think was the last name, found correlations between empathy and traits like extroversion and agreeableness. And it was suggesting that empathetic individuals may be more inclined to communicate due to their heightened social awareness, right? And that tracks well with what we just discussed about agreeableness, which was this idea that the idea of being cooperative and compassionate, you would have a higher willingness to communicate to maintain social harmony, right? So it tracks that empathy as an individual construct would also mesh with what we know about agreeableness. So that's like the Reader's Digest summary of what these traits usually correlate with, how they correlate with willingness to communicate. But I am interested in you finding an article that might support something I discussed, or maybe it conflicts with an idea, because I think, and for some of these traits, there's no unified finding, right? They're just trying to make conjectures on how personality plays into willingness to communicate, because I do agree with the theory that it is a foundational component, but can it extend beyond just extroversion and introversion? Because that's really where the majority of the scholarship actually lies. And so a lot of researchers actually find the correlations with those two traits as opposed to the others. But I'm gonna let you guys explore the rest of the traits later, or pick one that you want to explore and expand upon for the discussion board. So I want to turn my attention to introversion, um, and extroversion, I guess, concurrently, because I have a commentary on this framework, which is why I spent so much time building up to it. So bottom line, and there's a lot of text on here, but I have a lot to talk about as well. So we're just going to talk now. The bottom line is that in general, the studies, as you can imagine, correlate extroversion with willingness to communicate, right? So they're showing that if you're high extroversion, you are more likely going to have a higher willingness to communicate. And that probably makes a lot of sense. I don't have to pound that in the head. Now, there's key reasons why basically they're saying that, and some of them you can deduce yourself, but I want to highlight a couple of the key arguments from scholarship that talks about this. So one of them is that they see that introverts have a preference for like solitary learning, right? So they may favor activities like reading and writing and listening over speaking, which somewhat aligns a little bit with what we learned last week with the 4 language domains. But we also know from that research that introverts can excel in the speaking, but it's all about the context, right? So on the one hand, sure, the preference for solidarity and the general understanding of what we know about introversion makes a lot of sense on why they might scale lower in willingness to communicate. And again, we're going to look at an assessment in a minute. And when you see those questions, you'll understand even more why they will score low in a willingness to communicate. But there's 2 other arguments for why introverts tend to have a lower WTC, and they are of interest to me. First is that there is basically this overwhelming idea, which we've hammered several times in this class against, which is that introverts are more self-conscious. They have a higher communication anxiety. And this is shared in the scholarship as a matter of fact, right? The other is that introverts are communicated in scholarship as having like a lower self-perceived competence. So they underestimate their linguistic abilities. which affects their confidence engaging in conversations. So what we have is a large group of studies taking large groups of students, finding out who's an extrovert, finding out who's an introvert, and having them take this willingness to communicate assessment. And what they're finding is that the extroverts highly correlate with being willing to communicate per this assessment. And so we have I feel like we have the situation where we have people shouting into or the echo chamber. I'm giving, well, how about this? I'm putting in bad data, so I'm getting bad data out, would be kind of the idea. When I show you the assessment, I'll expand upon that a little more. But it's kind of a self-reinforcing thing because everyone's using the same assessment to test for willingness to communicate. So we're going to get the same results because the assessment, as you'll see, really favors extroversion in terms of what being willingness to communicate means or is defined in this assessment. The issue is that we have this issue where introverts are not scoring high in willingness to communicate. So scholars are seeking to explain that. And two of the explanations are that introverts have low self-esteem and that they have anxiety. But you and I know when we go back to the basic tenets of personality trait theory and we look at the introversion internal drive and the manifestations that it isn't likely anxiety. It isn't likely low self-esteem. It can be, but it's not guaranteed. It's not a 1-for-1, right? But we've got a good handful of studies showing that supporting this idea. Okay, so it's basically treated as common knowledge, and it's treated as common knowledge because I'll give an example here. So okay, so the first line up there, McIntyre et al, and then you've got Betty et al. They all found that when they did their study that people who were introverted and those with low self-esteem and those with low those with communication apprehension, they all were unwilling to communicate. All right. So what they've found is that, okay, so my introverts and those with low self-esteem and those with communication apprehension are all unwilling to communicate. So it must be introversion as the issue, right? So what they're doing is they're likening those three ideas to being the same trait in a sense. But in Betty's article, they go on to say that the characteristics of introversion, being shy, being quiet, are actually an indication of anxiety, or they say specifically may be an indication of anxiety. So you've got basically a study where they found that introversion doesn't correlate with a willingness to communicate, and that is because introverts have anxiety. What's interesting and what want to draw your attention to is that it doesn't say because introverts have anxiety as found in these studies. It just says point blank, introverts basically have anxiety, and it doesn't quote anybody. And so that's the difference between, that's an example of what common knowledge is, right? So we don't tell when we teach citing and referencing to college freshmen, right? We talk about how you don't need to cite common knowledge. Well, what's common knowledge? Well, it's knowledge that everyone accepts, right? It's generally accepted points and knowledge. So one of the issues in SLA literature is that saying introverts have anxiety is becoming common knowledge, but it's not true, right? I'm very passionate about, we got to save the introverts because it's not true. So, what I'm trying to figure out what that other scholarship was. Group studies of intro with self-esteem and anxiety. So, yeah, basically what's happening is they're grouping together this idea of self-esteem and anxiety with introversion and sharing that as like a universal facet of introversion. Conversely, we do have some other studies that are a little more optimistic. So what this McIntyre 2007 study found was that those who are, they gave basically introverts and extroverts like a vocabulary test, but like a willingness to communicate based vocabulary test. And what they found is that the introvert test performed better in this willingness to communicate. It was a modified scale, by the way. It wasn't the same assessment. I'll show you in a minute. But introverts had a higher willingness to communicate when they were getting to communicate in a familiar environment. Conversely, extroverts had the higher willingness to communicate when they were getting to communicate in an unfamiliar environment. So what we're seeing with this study, which I think is really optimistic, is that context is super important. So an issue I have with so much scholarship suggesting that extroverts are the most willing to communicate is that I think what we're finding is that enough context have a variety of we haven't looked at enough context to show how the introvert can shine through, right? Because as soon as we did and we looked at this minutia of the being in a familiar versus unfamiliar situation, we found that, oh, introverts actually outperformed extroverts in willingness to communicate. Let's see here. Then we got this other study from 2011. Introverts are unwilling to communicate. They perceive themselves as less confident. Same issue. But what this scholar said was because they lack experience and practice with the target language. So it was that since introverts are unwilling to communicate, and as we've preached this whole lecture, right, that being willing to communicate is the goal. Since they're unwilling to communicate, it must be that they perceive themselves as less competent because they don't have the same experience as the extrovert and they don't get the same practice as the extrovert. So again, it's just to me a bunch of ignorance. I get the idea behind it because everyone has this misnomer about introversion. I understand that. And there might be some truth to some of this, but it's a pretty strong statement to make. Now, here's another interesting study. In this study, in 96, and there may be more studies like this, but they found that when they were looking at SLA students, they found that those with extroversion actually had high extroversion and high academic performance extroverts that are high, something like this, and then are high extroverts. So they're really good students, and they're also really high in extroversion. That they had, that they also were really, I guess, basically found to have anxiety. But what was really interesting to me was the narration about anxiety in this study. So what they found was what they did is they described it as, oh, but it's a good anxiety. So one of the first studies that shows that language learners with extroversion have anxiety, and the narration is not the same narration given to the introvert. The narration is, but this is a good anxiety, meaning the extrovert uses it to propel themselves forward in language learning. And to me, that's an issue because anxiety on the same anxiety scale as used in some of these other studies that the introvert associates with is it's like, oh, this anxiety is holding them back, right? So to me, there's a little misnarrative going on. It's very subtle, but I'm seeing the patterns. I don't know if you are, but there's definitely a pattern of miscommunication. And ultimately, what I think is the rewarding of extroversion that keeps happening, right? Maybe it's doing a disservice to extroversion too, because it's putting too much faith in their innate ability with something. When the real message, I think, of that study and there's other studies showing extroverts get anxiety too, is that, we might be overlooking how to help extroverts with anxiety be successful because we're just assuming they're going to be good at this, right? Let me see if there was something else I wanted to add on here. So really, we've got this issue with introversion, I think, getting a bad rap in this model. So let me go ahead and show you real quick the assessment. So the first thing we did was talk about the theory, and then we talked about the framework. We looked at the pyramid. And now I want to talk to you about, and I've referenced it, how they're assessing a willingness to communicate. So this is the original instrument, and I'll zoom in a little bit. You're going to get to see this inside the course shell as well. And its sources are down here. So McCroskey, it's an older scale, right? There are some modified versions of it, but this is the one that's the most commonly used, okay? So it's the baby. It's the OG, I guess is what I mean. But let's take a look at some of the questions. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because this will be part of the discussion board. But so the idea of a willingness to communicate is that you are seeking opportunities to use the target language, right? So the questions here are things like, on a never or always scale, how likely are you to talk with a service station attendant? How likely are you to talk with a physician? How likely are you to present a talk to a group of strangers? How likely are you to talk with an acquaintance while standing in line? Talk with a salesperson, talk in large meetings, talks with the police officer, talk. Okay. So what you're seeing, and I think is reinforced by the scale itself, is that willingness to communicate is about talking. It's about constant output, right? And built into the idea is this: are you pursuing practice opportunities, right? But by the very nature of the scale, obviously what's being rewarded or assessed here is, are you going to talk? Are you going to talk? And my thoughts on this are that the scale itself is really kind of more like a personality trait scale assessing extroversion, right? So we get this idea of talk with a service station attendant. Well, first of all, as an extrovert, I don't always like to talk to them, right? But what I'm getting at here is I think what we're seeing is it's a lot of context dependent situations. But we also know that introverts tend to like to be more selective in who they talk to, right? So where is that in here? Oh, talk in a small group. Great. We know introverts would love that. Oh, but of strangers. Okay, well, you lost me, right? Where then is talk in a small group in general? Let me see. Okay, here we go. Talk in a small group of acquaintances. An introvert will probably gravitate towards that one, right? But then you've got all these people that we don't know. We've got a garbage collector, a secretary, a salesperson, a physician, a service station attendant. So it's also many more scenarios in which the introvert and also some extroverts. I know some of you are looking at that going, oh, that's a lot. I mean, I even don't want to call my hairstylist to schedule an appointment, right? There's anxiety in there. Where I have a feeling my analysis of this is that ultimately what's happening here is it's ultimately measuring assertiveness and spontaneity, right? How willing are you to talk in the spur of a moment? And those would be manifestations in some of those internal behaviors of an extrovert, right? So it's kind of, to me, more like off the cuff assessment, but I am curious to know, I want you to take the assessment. That's what you're going to do. It's not very long, but you're going to take it as an L1 speaker or as an L2 speaker, however you prefer. But I want to reflect on how, whether or not you think this is giving justice to introversion in the language learning process. So let me expand upon that a little more real quick. Let me go back over here. I think I'm on the slide. Okay, so earlier you saw the quote, the goal of language learning is to engender in the speaker a willingness to communicate, right? So I've got a modified version here. So willingness to communicate, I think you can see from the assessment, is really about quantity of communication, frequency of communication. And because of this, I think that innately in the model, it favors extroverts due to their natural inclination just to engage in conversation or be a part of conversation. However, what I think is that the focus on the quantity overlooks the significance of the quality of communication, which to me can be just as important, especially for introverts who may not seek out numerous interactions, but rather engage deeply in the few interactions they do, pursue. So what I'm proposing is the current definition of willingness to communicate actually inadvertently deems introversion as a weakness. And because it's in the pyramid and in the framework as like the foundational component, right? It ultimately, I think, is doing it's further festering this idea that introversion is a weakness, or that it is something to be treated and intervened on, and as something that's going to hinder you in the language learning process. So if the goal is to encourage communication simply based on frequency, then this model highly, I think, communicates that introversion then is going to hold you back, right? So what would you do as an educator if you learn that something about a student is going to hold them back from language learning? Well, you would basically intervene on that, right? And you put in interventional steps to make them to maybe eradicate that thing, right, holding them back so that they can be the other thing, in this case, extroversion, to move them forward. So what I'm suggesting is that to provide more of a nuanced understanding of willingness to communicate, or we should basically it should be redefined to encompass both the quantity, but also the quality of communication. And this is distinct from linguistic competence. I'm not saying quality in terms of it's phonologically accurate, it's syntactically, morphologically accurate. I'm just saying the depth, right? The success, right? The comprehension is there. But what I think this does is acknowledges that introverts can be just as willing to communicate, albeit in a different way. So I'm proposing that the goal of language learning should not only be to foster the willingness to communicate, but to encourage a willingness to communicate when necessary. Because I think what comes out of the current model is you have an L1, this is my mic drop moment, okay? So when you perceive introversion ultimately as something holding a student back, what becomes the goal of language teaching is how can I turn this L1 introvert into an L2 extrovert? But really the goal should be how can I turn this L1 introvert into a competent L2 introvert? And the way to do that, I don't believe, is to force upon them a willingness to communicate in terms of the quantity aspect, which is what I feel the model currently does. So I am curious on your opinions on this, though, because I think this ties really well into all of our earlier content in terms of how classroom instruction and teachers interact in the classroom, right? That rewarding of extroversion I've kind of been alluding to, and classroom activities, right? We do a lot with things that I think are highly extroverted focused. And our concerns with our quiet students, the interventions we do there are just to try to make them talk more, right? How do we get them to talk? And admittedly, I did a presentation years ago called Get Them to Talk, right? So getting introverts to be more advanced and willing to communicate. And let's admit if you want to get an introvert to talk more, there are steps to take to do that, such as acknowledging their classroom preferences, their language learning strategy differences, acknowledging the core tenets of the talent of being an introvert, which is the preference to be with people that they're comfortable with, right? So the intervention there, if you are trying to get them to talk more so that you as the educator know it's clicking, that they're taking on the language, it can't just be a blanket, you need to talk more, go talk to the gas station attendant after class today, right? We need to build in scenarios that match the goal of the introvert, which is not quantity of conversation, but of quality. How can I pedagogically build in opportunities where that person's getting to contribute in a quality way? And one of the low-hanging fruits, obviously, is letting them use like that online formatting as well. So I'm curious, I'm kind of seeing a sync between all the content to this point, but I would love to hear your feedback too in the discussion board this week. So that kind of concludes this willingness to communicate framework. So lay it on me in the discussion board. So the homework is you're going to do the willingness to communicate assessment. Again, it's really easy, but you'll share your results on the Google slide and the Google sheet as we do. And then also you'll find, go seek out an article discussing another personality trait, and this willingness to communicate framework as well. Next week, we're going to start class with an RStudio demonstration. So I'm going to look at the Luke data you guys did back, I think, in week 3. And you guys did a little analysis on it yourself, but I want to show you how we would do the Pearson biserial correlation inside of Luke, just to see from a statistical standpoint, did we actually have any results from our data, even though it was a small sample size, right? We're also going to review the extrovert introvert simplified English personality test that you guys took last week. I've already looked at your results, and there's a couple ways to approach that from a validity standpoint. Validity and reliability is what I meant to say. So we're going to look at that together, and then we'll move into the second half of the class, or the second half of the class next week. Third half, I guess, will be second language learning aptitude. So what we're really trying to answer is the question of who has a greater propensity to acquire a second language, right? From personality trait theory, do we have evidence at any point to suggest that one trait actually does have an upper hand, right? And so we're going to answer that question next week. But that concludes today. I've got some of those references there, so you guys will see that online. And all right, that's it. I'm going to go stop recording. I'll talk to you guys later.